I don't think Reform has taken a particularly market-oriented or economically sensible approach. They don't look nice, so let's tax them as well. Battery storage, we're against that for some reason. Let's ban it. These are all very kind of authoritarian, kind of leftist approaches to the way of doing things.
Free cities, because if you had local governments being essentially run like private businesses because they would have to be, then that would essentially look quite similar to a market.
The NHS is nearly 20% less productive than it was before the pandemic.
Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager here at the Institute for Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. We bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and focus on the foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. Today we're going to be discussing Reform's newly announced energy policies, public sector productivity, but first, let's talk about the government's new plans for new towns. Kristian, what have the government announced this week?
Well, it looks like we're finally getting somewhere with the new towns. So they've talked about this before, even before the election, but they're now more specifically talking about a little over 100 sites that they're actually looking at, and they're going to draw up a short list. So up to a dozen of those, they said, will become actual new towns, or in the sense that construction is going to start by the end of this parliament. And so, as always, the usual caveat is I'll believe it when I see it. I remember we've all said this about different policies and different contexts on this podcast. Because in this particular case, it is true that David Cameron was already talking about something like this. Gordon Brown was before him. It just never happened. But in this case, they are at a more advanced stage than previous governments were. So it looks like we're getting somewhere. And, well, new towns are, and the way they're currently doing it is, of course, not ideal from a classical liberal perspective, because it very much is, you have a government commission or whatever the exact institution is, looking at different sites and looking at viability. And that does sound a bit like central planning. Ideally, you would just have private developers looking at where they think building new settlements makes sense. But okay, we are in such a bad place with the housing situation that I guess it doesn't really matter. Almost anywhere, if it's reasonably near a population center, would probably be a good place, and there would be some demand for housing there. It looks as if, one of the problems with the post-war wave of new towns was that some of them were in the middle of nowhere, and these places then don't really take off. So they don't become economic centers in their own right. And it looks as if, and okay, it will depend on what the shortlist will be in the end, but it looks as if they accept that and they try to place them near existing population centers, or even just as extensions. So extensions of existing urban areas, where I guess you could say if we didn't have such a mad planning system in any other OECD country or most other OECD countries, these would just be urban extensions, and these would just be some new development projects. There would not be a name for it. There would not be a political project. There would not be a government saying we're doing this and we're looking at 100 sites or whatever. It would just happen, and you wouldn't read about it except maybe in the local press. Again, the starting situation, far from ideal, but any kind of housing development is good. And if it has to happen in this way, well, any way is good, or any ways of extending, of increasing housing supply is better than nothing. And it does look a bit like I keep coming back to Home Win here, where I describe this possible hypothetical future in which Britain has solved the housing crisis, and where the narrator from the future, I think 2035 is the year, looks back on the bad old days, which is, well, roughly where we are now, and says this is how it happened. And so far it looks a bit like this. So it is a bit, I've said this before, it's a bit as if all the conspiracy theories were true, and Tufton Street really does run the country. So especially if, Starmer said something about how he is not ruling out that at least one of those new towns could be on the green belt. And they will give priority to the southeast. So this does look like this fictitious place that I'm basing this in. So there's a new London borough called London Beavertown, which I think I imagined that to be somewhere to the southeast of London, but as a direct annex to London as it is now. And from the way Starmer describes these new towns, it could well be that my London Beavertown is, he probably called it something else, but it might become an actual thing. And yeah, maybe if it does happen, then we can do the next, if I do an updated version of this, we can film it in the actual London Beavertown.
That's really interesting, Kristian, and it'll be interesting to see what the next few weeks look like and any of the government's new proposals on what this looks like in practicality. Tom, what do you think?
Well, I don't think they're going to call it Beavertown. I'm going to have to ask you off air how you came up with that name for your new London borough. Niemitzville maybe makes just as much sense. But anyway, I think it's quite interesting to consider the history of new towns here before we talk about the announcement that the government has made. Because, if you go back to before the Town and Country Planning Act and the way that British urban areas developed, it was either repeated waves of densification, so you'd have built something and then the land would become so valuable to make greater use of it, you'd demolish and you'd rebuild it, taller buildings, higher densities, etc. You also had, first of all, you had a series of urban extensions, things like Edinburgh New Town, appended onto Edinburgh, very beautiful. You've seen those kind of things happen. And then I suppose in the 20s, the 30s, you started to get ribbon development where people were building along arterial roads and railways and stuff heading out of London and out of other big cities. And a lot of people wanted to live in such places, still want to live in such places. I think that for the urban planner, they didn't like this idea. And this is maybe where that kind of myth of Britain's green and pleasant land being concreted over originally came from. And that was why you started to get the kind of urban containment in the form of the green belt, and why it basically became, after the Second World War, very difficult to build anything anywhere, irrespective of market demand. Now, post-war, Clement Attlee's government, Town and Country Planning Act, basically tied up development in red tape. It nationalised development rights, effectively. And in essence, it said, you can't keep demolishing and densifying, so you can't build your cities up, at least not with the freedom that you used to be able to. You can't extend your cities anymore, whether it's urban extensions or whether it's sort of ribbon development out along arterial routes. But don't worry, we realise that you still need new houses, but we're going to do it through these fabulous socialist planned new towns, which will dot around the country where it makes sense to our bureaucratic mindset to do so. And that was where the new supply of housing to meet increased demand was supposed to be coming from. I mean, I guess there was also an element to which large-scale council house building at the time was meant to satisfy demand. Although you'll know this better than me, Kristian, I think often they were demolishing existing kind of Victorian terraces or whatever, replacing them with modern high-rise or mid-rise blocks. They weren't actually increasing the supply of housing. They were just putting it into a different, and I think we would all say subsequently inferior form, but that was the ideology of the time. But, council house building petered out after a while. But the New Towns programme, yes, they built a few. They never built as many as they intended to. For the most part, the new towns were failures. They weren't popular. People hated them. And so I think it was probably around the 1970s or something, the steam completely came out of that programme as well. And I should say, Samuel Watling had a really nice article on this for Works in Progress a while ago, which, as I speak, I realise I'm probably pulling some of these points from him, so fair to give him some attribution. But I also think the experience of new towns probably taught us a few things about new towns going forward if we're going to build them. And one is, A, they're much better off if they're attached directly onto existing urban developments where there is demand for them. There probably is a case for building entirely new settlements as the population grows and everything, and as our economic geography changes. But you have to be quite careful about where you put them. And I say you have to be quite careful. Of course, if this was market-driven, price signals would tell you where to go. If you're planning it like a government does, then you have to bear certain things in mind. And I think probably you can look at Milton Keynes and a few of the other new towns from the post-war period that have done fairly well and it's location. Basically, you have to be connected to big, growing urban environments, chiefly London, although there are probably other examples as well, and you have to have the infrastructure there. So something like Tempsford, which has been talked about, which is where the East Coast Main Line intersects with, what's it called, East-West Rail, between Oxford and Cambridge, that would make a lot of sense to put a new town there because of the connections, both east-west and north-south. And that obviously, if there's going to be a lot more development in the Oxcam corridor, again, believe it when I see it, but that would be sensible economically, then that makes sense as well. But as I say, this is all a substitute for actually having a functioning market in development, which you don't have to try and second guess. And the only thing I want to pick you up on, Kristian, and I think you kind of corrected yourself a little bit already, but you said, given the situation that we're in, new towns just about anywhere would be okay and an improvement on the status quo. And whether that's strictly true, I'm not quite sure, right? Because I think there are parts of the country where the economy is not doing so well. Our economy is not doing so well overall, frankly, but there are particularly left behind bits of the country where even now, I think building is only really happening because of the peculiarities of the planning system. And I think you see very low quality construction because actually they're only barely viable. A lot of developments that are going on when you take into account all of the costs and the sale price that they're going to get. And that's why you see kind of shoddy construction and, actually a lot of animosity in some cases towards new build housing, as if all new build has to be of a relatively low standard. So I do think that there is a serious danger in a way that new towns, if they're pursued inappropriately, tarnish the whole kind of pro-development, planning liberalisation mindset. But I will say, it appears to me that as far as bureaucratic planning goes, the government seems to be thinking in the right direction. And they have talked about new towns sometimes being attached to existing cities. They have talked about them going where it makes sense from infrastructure standpoint and market demand and everything else. So look, if we're going to build some new towns and they're going to be successful and they're going to sort of mimic what would have happened in a market system, then I'm all for it.
Excellent. No, it's really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what that looks like over the next few months, especially for those specific plans. It is interesting you said, Tom, that if it's not done correctly, then it could, I suppose, fuel additional NIMBY tendencies and could. I mean, do you think that that's a genuine risk that could throw out this entire process?
I mean, it's definitely a genuine risk because, and this seems to me to have been one of the fallacies of the original New Towns project, right? That you thought, well, there's an awful lot of opposition to building around London or for demolishing existing buildings and putting up bigger ones. Why don't we just take a bit of the countryside and build something entirely new there? Now, if the countryside was completely uninhabited and you were sort of colonizing or settling a wilderness, fine. But actually, there are people everywhere, and I think the ferocity of opposition to new towns, if they're placed inappropriately, or frankly, if they're just developed in a way that isn't to people's liking, yes, I think that it could easily be the kind of thing that if you make that your mission as the housing ministry, that we're going to deliver new housing through new towns, you could just end up fighting, getting nowhere. And then a lot of the things that you could have achieved through sensible planning liberalisation don't happen because governments have limited bandwidth. That's the danger. I don't want to be a naysayer on this. And I, for one, would be very happy to go and live in Kristian's Beaver Town.
It's going to be such a glorious place. Now, of course, if we had a sensible planning system, you wouldn't need new towns, or rather, they could happen, but they would just be a local initiative. It could even be a private company. I guess in an ideal world, there will be this paper here on free cities. But even in a non-libertarian world, you could imagine just local governments saying, well, we want to release some land here, or developers saying, how about this place here? Price signals are telling us there's some demand here. You wouldn't need a national policy of any kind. It could just happen in lots of different ways around the country. But within the given system, I guess you need, well, firstly, they don't seem to have the political will or even the knowledge of how to do it, how to completely overhaul the planning system. So working within that system, for now, if you want to see some quick results, you need to accept the central planning approach for now and go for either increased housing targets or just designating places and saying, build here.
It is interesting, actually, that, and this is way back in the IEA archive. I can't remember the name of the publication, but there is a kind of post-war new town in America, which happens to be where my wife grew up, Columbia, Maryland, and it was developed by a guy called James Rouse, and it's widely regarded as a very nice place to live and an example of, and it's very much planned, like very master planned, and they've sort of tried to mix up different socioeconomic groups and everything. So it's not exactly a kind of spontaneous order, but then spontaneous order is never meant to be about sort of pure unplanned chaos. It's meant to be about the competition between lots of different individual and business plans and so on. But he wrote an essay contribution to an old IEA publication basically about private planning. And I think that is the thing that we should think about. This was not chosen by the US federal government or by Maryland state government, as far as I know. This was pure competition, a developer who saw an opportunity to build what he saw as a kind of model new development between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And it turned out to be very successful, I guess, because he had his own money riding on making it a success.
Well, yeah, I was about to say, I mean, it's his own money that he's invested in that. And of course, as an entrepreneur, you're taking those risks and you're risking your own capital. And so there are just different incentives purely, which is obviously not the case here. Before we move on, just specifically on this paper that the IEA released earlier this year, Beyond Free Ports by Vera Kitchenova, she sort of talks about the extension to special economic zones and how that could develop effectively semi-autonomous from what she calls free cities. What would that actually look like and how do you think that could actually be applied in the UK?
Yeah, so her basic idea is simply that the provision of residential areas with communal spaces and a set of rules so that people can live together, that's essentially an entrepreneurial activity like any other. That you could think of that as a business activity, not that different from providing a shopping center or an airport or whatever else. And you could even say an airport, Heathrow Airport, feels a bit like a mini, well, not so mini city. In the sense that they have internal infrastructure, and every large airport does that, and they have lots of communal spaces, and they have to set some rules for the people who pass through that airport. Would it really be such a big change if Heathrow said, and now we're also building a block of flats, and you can literally live in Heathrow City? Would that be such a big change from where we are now? In a sense, the provision of residential areas, you could think of that as a business activity. We now have a setup where that is done by councils, but that's not the only way in which that can be done. Historically, it wasn't. In large parts of the world today, it's not the only way. And so I'm not expecting that in the near future we're going to see lots of private Hong Kongs, private Singapores developing on British soil. But I don't know, you could go for various mixed arrangements so they are already setting up, these new towns are going to be built by organizations which are called development corporations, and these are going to be regional government entities. Why not do something like that with a private company, developer, whatever? Why not let Tim Martin build his Wetherspoon City or something? That doesn't mean that is somehow outside of the United Kingdom and that the normal rules and regulations no longer apply. It could just be, as you said, a semi-autonomous zone where you just subcontract various services to a private provider, and you could also then tell them the people who live there, they pay their rent to whoever builds that place, and they get a council tax rebate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would definitely live in a private Wetherspoons town, which is listing my housing preferences here. But I mean, I think it would be fascinating to see what would happen if at least one of these new towns, right, they said, well, we'll try something different here. And okay, maybe it's developed by a development corporation, but hopefully that could be a private one. When people move in, rather than just incorporating it into a council area or creating a new council for it with the traditional local democratic model, what if you said, this is a commercial development. And if you buy into it, you're becoming a shareholder with rights over the management. And that could be a right that you could trade in certain ways as well. And you could actually try and imagine how could a residential area or a whole urban environment effectively be privatized and privately managed, and see what kind of innovations and different approaches that could lead to. Because I think one of the problems we have with local government in Britain generally is, well, there are lots of problems, right? But in theory, local government and the decentralization of power should be something that free marketeers and libertarians are very keen on, because to the extent that there are certain things that it's very hard to be supplied competitively in a market way, you still want to have sort of choice and exit as much as possible. And so if you have different localities which are pursuing slightly different policies and doing things in different ways, okay, it's nowhere near as good as a market. But if it's easy to opt out to move to the neighbouring one or something, then you at least have some sort of competitive pressure. Now, that does depend on having the right incentives for those local authorities. I think crucially, they have to be raising a lot of their own money to make sure their incentives are aligned correctly. But we don't really get that. So, I mean, our local governments in Britain are basically just agencies of central government. They are dominated fiscally by central government. They are largely told what to do in a variety of different ways by central government. For the most part, they're not really very effective, efficient, or sensible governing units either. They are basically the product of various different central plans at various different times which have overlapped. They're not things that have kind of evolved organically in a way that makes sense. So I think you're in a situation in the UK where basically you can see the principled case for decentralizing political power and you can see the advantages that it might have. But when you think of it practically, you just think, well, no, there's no point doing that because it's all wrong where we're starting from. And maybe if you're doing a wave of new towns, then that, again, is an opportunity to think, well, maybe we can do that differently.
Certainly an interesting solution. Let's move on to...
Can I just add one sentence to that? If we had a fully decentralized arrangement, then there would be far less demand for something like that, free cities, because if you had local governments being essentially run like private businesses, because they would have to be, because they raise their own tax revenue, and if they lose taxpayers, then they are in trouble, then that would essentially look quite similar to a market. And then even if you allowed free cities, private cities, there would be far less demand for it because there would be so much that you could do within the existing system. So if you had, say, in Switzerland or even Canada, if they allowed something like that, I would imagine that there might be some experiments, but it would not be taken up on a massive scale. Here, where we have this hyper-centralized governance arrangement, and where it is genuinely difficult to reform that across the board, this could be a way of just sidestepping that problem, where you could say, right, we will leave the system as it is for now, because that will take some time to sort out. But from today on, you can set up, going back to the development corporations. Why should they all be owned by regional governments? Or why shouldn't some of them be private companies?
Fiscal decentralization is certainly an interesting solution to this, because if you look at countries like Spain, in which they are pretty fiscally decentralized, it means that those local authorities do have the incentive to want more taxpayers in their area because they are responsible for raising their own revenue. Let's move on. So Reform this week have announced new energy policies. So that's included a windfall tax on renewable generated power, a solar farm tax on farmers taking the renewable subsidy, a ban on battery energy storage systems, and legislation to force the national grid to put cables underground. So I think that it's been really interesting to sort of hear the reasoning and the kind of rationale behind a lot of these policies. I interviewed our energy analyst Andy Mayer to discuss a lot of the different solutions that they seem to think are the case. They've sort of branded it as this is them ending net zero. They want to end net zero. And I suppose the sort of first response to that would be, well, you end net zero by ending the legally binding net zero target and repealing the Climate Act. That should be the first thing that any energy policy should look at. But let's just sort of look at these one by one. So the windfall tax on renewable generated power, it seems to me the rationale is these industries already take a huge amount of government subsidies. Those subsidies are arranged through private contractors, and so there isn't really an easy way for the government to take a step back, at least over basically the next decade or so. So this is effectively a way for them to tax those windfalls. I suppose that makes sense, although it does sound as though this is an anti-technology policy. It's not necessarily that they are interested in removing those subsidies in the first instance. Indeed, that wasn't referenced at all in this announcement. But they just fundamentally want to be anti-technology. And we want to be very clear about this. Making one form of energy more expensive does not create cheap and abundant energy, which is ultimately what we need. The second policy announcement, so a solar farm tax on farmers taking the renewable subsidy. Again, it could be a way in which you could take back some of those subsidies that the government had already promised in those pre-existing circumstances. But it doesn't, to me, seem the best way to approach that. And ultimately, what you end up having is new taxes on farmers that decide to do create solar farms on their own property, which to me is a violation of their own private property rights, and they should surely be able to do whatever they want with their own farmland as well. And ultimately, solar farms probably wouldn't be very profitable in the UK if it wasn't for those subsidies. So the first thing should be to remove those subsidies and ensure that the policy is technologically neutral in the first instance. The third policy, banning battery energy storage systems, seems a little bit random. The rationale behind it is that these systems are unsafe and that we have inadequate regulation and that the only way to do this is just to ban it altogether. It seems like a quite bizarre policy to go directly for an outright ban. If the argument is that regulation at the moment is inadequate for safety reasons, surely then the solution would be to regulate it and manage those risks in a smart way. But that's just not the case. I mean, we already have quite extensive health and safety regulations for industrial planning, and that does include these battery energy storage systems as well. I think I remember seeing some of them that are about 147 pages of regulation, so we already have that. But either way, even if that wasn't the case, an outright ban is certainly not the solution and definitely is an anti-technology policy. And this fourth policy, legislating to force the national grid to put all new cables underground, generally just is going to make building these cables so much more expensive. Underground, it's incredibly corrosive. You have to dig them up in order to maintain that kind of infrastructure. And effectively, this is them saying pylons and cables overhead just don't look very nice. And so we're going to increase the cost of building them by up to 10 times, which to me is just a egregious waste of taxpayer money, and what that money should be spent on is building new nuclear power stations. What do you make of this, Tom?
Well, I think I don't think reform has taken a particularly market-oriented or economically sensible approach. I think, to be fair, a couple of things you said there probably weren't especially free market or economic-based either. I mean, the last point, we don't want the government deciding where to spend taxpayers' money. We would like this to be actually a functional market in which private investors make bets and, they succeed or fail based on the returns. And that would, depend on how successful their technologies are, the demand for their product and so on. I mean, it's always very, very dangerous, I think, with energy. You get sucked into the planner's mindset to a certain extent. But we should definitely try and sort of fight against that as far as possible.
Yeah, surely then the solution is to deregulate planning around building new nuclear power stations, especially those smaller nuclear reactors that are much more easily manageable in terms of the safety risks. And then also at the same time, ensuring that we do have new oil and gas licenses, that we are able to drill the oil that we currently have and use those natural resources as well. And again, removing all of those subsidies. But that wasn't in any of these policies. So you're right, the solutions that I provided were not necessarily free market, but they are better than what they provide.
So I think in a way, so let's first of all give credit where it's due. I think that reform, or at least being outspoken about the problems with net zero, and the fact that even if it's a nice aspiration, it is not a sensible way either to run environment and energy policy, but actually to try and orient your entire politics and government around this massive and sort of arbitrarily chosen objective and date. And it's causing all kinds of problems, I think, across government and across economic policy. And really, we need to unwind that. We need to unwind it quite desperately. Now, however, I think that they in the policies that they've come up with, they're actually exposing, I think, a common failing on the, if you want to call them the new right or the emerging right, populist right, whatever, which is not to kind of start from first principles and say, this is bad, based on our own way of seeing the world, this is the right approach. Often it's to use the same tools and the same mindset that your opponent, who you think is getting everything wrong, is using, but to just do everything the opposite. And so to a certain extent, and I'm not necessarily accusing reform of this, but you see it on things like free speech, where they get very worked up about kind of cancel culture and wokeification of public discourse. But then some people on this new ride are just desperate to jump down the throat of anybody on the left who steps out of line and punish them as well. And I mean, you see it a little bit with the Trump administration in the US. There are some kind of, free market liberating aspects to that as well. But there is also a sense of, well, we're just going to use the power of the federal government to punish our energies and put them back in their place. That's very dangerous. And I think to a certain extent, that's what's happening with this energy policy, right? They're saying, well, we don't think renewable energy is a good idea. So we'll put a windfall tax on it
and punish them.
We hate the way solar farms look in the countryside. And by the way, I think people really overreact about solar farms in the countryside. But anyway, they don't look nice. So let's tax them as well. Battery storage, we're against that for some reason. Let's ban it. These are all very kind of authoritarian, kind of leftist approaches to the way of doing things. And the point you made there, not to pick another fight with you, Reem, of course, but that it's already regulated, it's heavily regulated. Sure. Actually, wouldn't it be better if it was simply the case that the people who installed these battery power stations were taking significant liability on themselves? I mean, they are to a degree, but can you strengthen the private element of enforcement around safety as well as an alternative or as a supplement to government regulation? And then just on that final point about forcing cables underground, again, that we'd probably all prefer if we didn't see pylons and cables running around the countryside. On the other hand, our modern way of life depends on that kind of infrastructure, and it is vastly more expensive to put it underground. There is this point, though, if you're willing to pay the cost of putting the cabling underground, then I think that should be on you as a private actor. And so, for example, shouldn't be on taxpayers. So you could have a situation where a new town in the countryside, which is, built somewhere gorgeous and it's all very classical architecture or something. The people who live there really don't want to be able to see any kind of energy infrastructure anywhere near them. And as a result, they should just pay much higher energy prices. There's another problem there in the way that our energy market is structured, that you're basically charging a nationwide price when, in effect, the cost of energy in different places at different times is very different. So maybe there's another kind of liberalization you could pursue there, another kind of structural reform that would make some of these things possible, but without a political party or a government having to sit there and say, we like this, we don't like that, therefore this is how it's going to be.
Yeah, it's all vibes-based, as always. So renewable energy in the current context is just left-coded, and therefore, and this has been going on even before reform was a thing that you had. People on the right saying, therefore, you have to be against renewable energy rather than just being against a specific scheme of subsidies, where it could well be that in a market system, I mean, not right now, but over time, that renewable energy maybe is going to, at some point, pay its way and become very successful. I mean, costs have fallen massively. But it is very much, so the problem with net zero generally is that it leads to a rationing of the energy supply. And what also happens within that, though, is that we've seen within that shrinking energy supply, we do have special privileges for renewable energy, an expansion of that and driven by government policies. And therefore, some people mix this up and think, well, net zero and renewable energy are therefore intrinsically linked. If you are against net zero, you also have to be anti-renewable energy. And we somehow have to punish these industries. Well, I would say, of course, this is again, and I wouldn't start from here, situation. We should never have had all the renewable energy subsidies. But given that we've had them and that we have some long-term commitments, the solution isn't now to somehow punish them in retrospect for privileges they have received in the past. So what you should do is simply say we will try to phase them out as quickly as we can and go for a technology neutral approach, but also be comfortable with an expansion overall of the energy supply. And if we want to reduce emissions, again, when we've talked about this, just let the carbon cap and trade system do its job and don't mess around with it otherwise.
Yeah, it's really interesting also just in that point about technological advancement. I mean, you're absolutely right. There does seem to be a bit of a vibes problem here where it's we don't like net zero and therefore we want to punish the renewable energy industry. The point really is that as soon as you start trying to punish a particular sector, you are just going to make energy more expensive. And it seems that the aim here is for everyday people to have to pay less for their energy consumption. And this is certainly not the way to do that. The way is to pursue a policy of effectively deregulation of nuclear. I certainly think that is the future there. But we want cheap and abundant energy. And the reason that we don't have that is ultimately a political choice. Shall we move on? Tom, would you want to talk a little bit about public sector productivity?
Yeah, well, finally we've got to a glamorous topic. Yes, so I think this way, last week we had the Bank of England coming out with their downgrade of the growth forecast. And in the documentation, and Andrew Bailey, I think, said it himself, pointing the finger at public sector productivity. Effectively, the share of employment taken up by things like health and education and public administration, which are largely sort of public sector jobs in the UK, that's become a greater share of employment. At the same time, productivity in the public sector has been falling. So overall, that weighs very heavily on our overall productivity and on our growth. This week, I think you've seen the Office for National Statistics come out with a new set of data which reinforces this point. They've suggested that the state overall is 8.5% less productive than it was before the pandemic. Within that, in particular, the NHS is dragging things down. The NHS is nearly 20% less productive than it was before the pandemic. Worth saying that NHS England disagree. They say their own data suggests that they're becoming that they are less productive than they were before the pandemic. They don't dispute that, but that they say things are going in the right direction.
Mark from their own homework.
The Office for National Statistics disagrees. So obviously there's some confusion there. But I think overall, and this is quite a long-running trend now, public sector productivity growth has been weak, if not non-existent, in the UK for a long time. And one thing that's worth bearing in mind, we often would say just sort of lazily or colloquially, and this means we're getting less for every pound we put in or something, which is sort of true in the broad scale of things, but that's not actually what is being measured often with these. So the ONS figures, for example, are figures on input productivity. So it's things like, number of hours worked or number of teachers, number of doctors. It isn't adjusted for the price of those things. You can also look at funding productivity, which reflects the cost of all of your inputs, rather than just their quantity. And there, actually, it looks even worse, frankly. And it looks like a much longer run trend at the same time. There was interesting research from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I think it was last summer, which looked at the funding productivity of the public sector going all the way back to 1997. And they found basically the average growth rate, well, it was average shrinkage, that on average over that period from 97 to 2019, so before the pandemic, funding productivity in the public sector was falling by 0.3% a year. So we're talking relatively small numbers, but a long-run trend. Maybe one interesting little twist within that data is they broke it down into the 97 to 2009 phase, where I think it was like minus 0.8% a year average shrinkage in funding productivity in the public sector, versus 2009 to 2019, where it was very, very marginally positive, like probably within the margin for error positive. But I suppose that does suggest, actually, that very strict public spending controls, the so-called austerity program, did work to a certain extent to keep costs down and make sure that relative to the cost of providing services, the amount of output you were getting was increasing. So we're not in that situation now. We're in a situation where even if you leave aside the actual monetary costs and just focus on inputs, we are getting less out for what we put in. If you factor in the fact that public sector wage settlements have been much more generous and so on, my guess is that these figures are going to look even more negative. And if you're a country where the state is now, 45% of GDP heading upwards, if that bit of your economy is getting less and less productive over time, that's a big problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially as I think that public sector spending is supposed to exceed 50% over the next decade or so. So that you're absolutely right. I mean, if public sector productivity is indeed declining and getting worse, then ultimately the economy as a whole is becoming less productive. Especially as we see various new regulations on the workplace and others. Kristian, what do you make of these new statistics?
Yeah, part of the problem here is that the NHS is going through, as a politicized system, has for a long time been going through a feast and famine approach. So you have some periods when it expands rapidly, and then you have periods of not shrinkage, but say where it expands much more slowly, so the early Cameron years especially. And this is something that that also a lot of supporters of the current system are also criticizing. So the health think tanks, the King's Fund, the Nuffield Trust, they've written about this too. They, of course, think that this can all be addressed within the system we have. They would say, well, we just need better politicians and better health policy, where I would argue that once you have a nationalized industry, it does. What happens with that industry depends on the political mood of the day. You may have periods like in the early Blair years where there just is a political drive for expanding the budget and the workforce and very rapidly. And then you get other times, Cameron years especially, where the political priorities are very different, where you get a period of relative retrenchment. And then you had, and this didn't even start under the current government, this was already true in the Sunak days, or even before the pandemic a bit, where you suddenly had the thinking being, oh no, everybody hates us now because of austerity, so we need to throw more money at the NHS again and hire a lot more doctors and nurses. And you then get the problem that, I guess in any organization, if it grows very rapidly, you have lots of new people who don't yet know what to do there. Imagine this organization suddenly trebled in size. You would have lots of new people running around the building not knowing what to do. Of course, our productivity, if you measured it in the way the ONS does, would also decline. This would be especially true in the case of the NHS. It's especially true for funding productivity because the NHS suddenly has a much bigger budget. It doesn't yet have more input factors. It is sometimes bad at converting all that extra money into an additional workforce and healthcare equipment. And even once you have that, you still have the problem that these people are not immediately going to be as productive as the existing workforce. So it would be a very different situation if we had, rather than the feast versus famine approach, where you have sudden bursts where the organization grows massively and then periods where it flatlines. If you just had gradual growth over time, and this is true in some of the alternative systems that I've written about, it's also true that healthcare spending goes up over time, that the healthcare sector grows over time because of demographic pressures. So that is not a problem which is specific to this system. But there is just not an identifiable year where you can say, okay, these were the years where suddenly the healthcare budget was growing massively, where they were hiring lots more doctors and nurses. And this is the period where the opposite happened. There it's just a much more gradual growth because it doesn't depend so much on who is in government at the time or what the political priorities are. It's much more demand.
Capital investment, but famously there hasn't been much in the grand scheme of things in healthcare and maybe in some other public services. It tends to be the first thing that the axe falls on in a politicised system. It's easy to prioritise the day-to-day, but if you underinvest in capital and in healthcare, that will mean decent premises to provide healthcare services on, but also medical technology and everything else, then that probably limits your productivity or your potential productivity gains in the long run as well. I mean, I suppose that there are probably two different perspectives that you might hear on this topic. Why is the public sector, suffering low productivity, falling productivity? And we would say, and I think there's a lot of truth in this, it's because of the structure of the way these services are provided. And if you could have a system which introduced more choice, more competition, more commercial pressures, if you got government out of it to the extent that you can, then probably that would drive greater efficiency and greater productivity and everything as well. Now, on the other hand, I think some people will say, no, this is just inherent. It's the characteristics of the industries that you're talking about. Is it Formold's cost disease? Am I saying that right? Yeah. And that there are just certain things, quite labour-intensive industries, which inherently costs will grow more than output over time. Probably slightly distorting. You could fill us on the precise wording, and that healthcare and education and things like that, they're always going to be low productivity. It's just unfortunate if you have an aging population and you need more of those things, particularly healthcare and old age care and so on, then that's going to be particularly a drain on your overall economic performance. But it's something you have to make up elsewhere. And they would say, these market reforms are a bit of a red herring. I don't think that's right, but I'm also not sure, and Kristian, I'd be interested in your thought on this, whether there actually is good internationally comparable data on, say, healthcare system productivity. That you can easily say, well, Australia, which we would think of as a pretty model system maybe for the UK to follow, or the Netherlands, are they more productive than our system? And can you tie that to the particular attributes that they have? I'm honestly not sure.
I haven't seen good data on this. So there have been attempts to do this, but in a fairly crude way, where they're just thinking of measures like life expectancy, infant mortality as healthcare outputs, and then look at how the rate at which different systems put their inputs towards producing those outputs. But the problem is just that a lot of healthcare isn't, so especially in the more generously funded systems, it's not all just about saving lives. A lot of it is about improving well-being, but in ways that you cannot so easily measure in clinical terms. So you can have a system where a lot of healthcare is actually spent on things that, say, make you feel better, improve your quality of life, but they don't make you live longer. They don't translate into hard clinical outcomes. And that's one of the problems with attempts to measure productivity in this way. What you would have to do is somehow try to account for that and somehow find a way of figuring out what are they actually trying to achieve. And if you have a certain proportion of your spending that is just about of your healthcare spending that is just about improving people's well-being, then you wouldn't say it's inefficient if that kind of spending doesn't extend your life expectancy, because that was never the point of it.
Yes, I mean, even on all of the available metrics, the National Health Service fails miserably in comparison to our European counterparts. I think in the year before the pandemic, the National Health Service faced the second highest avoidable mortality rates in all of Western Europe. So even on the available metrics that we do have, the NHS fails to compete immeasurably. But it, of course, would be interesting to see what that would look like very specifically. And if there are models that we can create in order to actually measure productivity outside of mortality rates and survival rates and things like that. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Tom, Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then check out insider.iea.org.uk.